Hello, I'm Anika from Made to Sew. In this tutorial, we're going to be looking at how to sew an inseam pocket or a side seam pocket. And I'm going to be showing you a professional method that keeps the pocket towards the front of the garment during wear. To help with this class, I have a downloadable pocket pattern that you can get from my website, and I'll pop a link to that here. To get started, I would recommend grabbing some scraps of material, and perhaps you can make a sample.
Now, inseam pockets can be positioned into a dress or a skirt. Generally speaking, you want to ensure that your garment has enough ease for an inseam pocket. If you have a very fitted garment, you're more likely to see the pocket from the outside, and you may find that the pocket opening will gape. Now, there are many different methods for sewing inseam pockets. In this class, I'm going to be firstly showing you how to draft or add pockets to a garment, and then I'm going to be showing you how to sew two different methods. Both of these methods have pocket bags that are a separate pattern piece. They're not connected to the main garment. Method 1 is more of a standard side seam pocket method that you will probably find in your dressmaking pattern that you're working with. With this method, I stagger my pocket from the seam, making the pocket less visible. It is an easier method to sew. The second method is slightly more professional, but a little bit trickier to sew. It forces the pocket to sit towards the front of the garment, but the pocket is not staggered from the seam like the first version. I will pop the timings for the video so that you can skip to the part you want to learn in the description box below. We're going to firstly look at how to draft a pocket onto a pattern. This might be a pattern that you've drafted from your block or a pattern that you're working with. The first thing is to decide on the position of the pocket. In this particular garment, I chose to position the start of my pocket 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters down from the waist. The opening of my pocket was 17 centimeters, 6.5 inches. Mark these as notches on the side seam of the front and back of your garment. Then you can work to draw in your pocket shape. The pocket should be a curved shape with no corners, as corners are more likely to collect lint, and it should be large enough to fit your hand inside. I'm drafting for you on a half scale pattern. Here is my full size pattern. For some general rules, an inseam pocket opening can be anything from 5 inches, 13 centimeters, up to 8 inches at 20 centimeters. My preference is around the 6 to 6.5 inch opening, 15 to 17 centimeters. And you can place the pocket anywhere from 1 inch to 4 inches down from the waist, 2.5 to 10 centimeters. It's what works best for you and your body in your individual garment. Once you're happy with the pocket that you have drafted, you can then work to trace off the pocket pattern piece. I will be tracing my stitching line, which is what I've recorded, and adding my seam allowance. I usually work with a 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch seam allowance, all the way around the pocket pattern. Of course, my garment pattern will also have the same seam allowance at the side seam. If you're adding a pocket to a pattern that already exists, I would add the seam allowance to the pocket that your pattern has. I usually place the grain line for my pocket parallel to the side seam or opening. This helps to stabilize this area and prevent stretching. So you will have your front and your back pattern with your seam allowances down the side seam and the notches marked for the pocket opening. You will also have a pocket pattern with the seam allowances added. For your pocket pattern, you will need to have 4 pocket pieces. You can choose to have all of these in your exterior material, or you can have 2 in your exterior and 2 in a lining or a pocketing material. It's generally a good idea to stabilize the side seams of the garment where the pocket is going to be inserted with a fusible interfacing. I would always recommend positioning this on the front of the garment, but you may like to add it to the back of the garment as well. I'm using a strip of lightweight woven fusible interfacing. This measures 2 centimeters, 3/4 of an inch in width. If preferred, cut your own from a piece of interfacing. Cut it along the straight of grain. The strip of interfacing should be positioned 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch above and below the notches for the pocket, on the wrong side of your garment material. Align the strip of interfacing with the raw edge of your garment material. If you're working with a larger seam allowance than my 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch, you may need to increase the width of the interfacing or change the placement to ensure that you will be sewing in the interfacing. As we go through the two different sewing methods, I will be discussing when you should be finishing the raw edges of your fabric. You have the choice here to use an overlocker or serger, alternatively an overcast stitch on your sewing machine, or pinking shears. Now we're going to complete the sewing process for method 1, which will give you a pocket that looks like this from the outside. The pocket is slightly hidden as it's set back from the seam, and like this from the inside. We're going to start by finishing the pocket pieces at the overlocker or serger. You will want to finish the outside curved edge of all of the pockets, the 2 external and 2 lining pockets. And I'm going to be using my overlocker or serger for this, working my way around the outside curved edge of the pocket, making sure that I'm not cutting anything away with the blade. I'm simply finishing the raw edge of the material. It's important to try not to stretch the pocket shape here. You want to move the material and the shape of the curve through the machine as smoothly as you can. Once completed, trim your threads and give the pocket a flat press, as the overlocking may have pulled it up slightly. I like to check the pockets against one another to check that there hasn't been any stretching or distortion. The straight edge of the pocket has not yet been finished, as that will be finished once it's attached to the garment. Once you have the 4 pockets ready, the 2 exterior and the 2 lining, we can then attach them to the garment. We'll start with the front of the garment. Take your front with the right side facing up. If you decided to cut 2 pocket pieces in your lining and 2 in your exterior, the front has the lining pocket pieces attached. Place the lining pocket pieces with the right side of the lining pocket against the right side of your front material. The straight edge of the pocket and the side seam should align and the notches should match. Pin the pockets in place on both sides. I then like to fold my garment in half to double check that the pockets are perfectly aligned and that the distance from the underarm to the top of the pocket and the pocket to the hem is the same on both sides. We will then move on to the back of the garment. And on the back of the garment, we have the pockets in the exterior material. The back of the garment needs to have the right side facing up, and you will place your pocket with the right side facing down, so the right sides are together, on top of your back. Once again, you want to align the straight edge of the pocket to the straight side seam of the garment, matching the notches. Pin in position and work to double check that both sides of the back have the pocket in the same position. Just like with the front, I'm checking from the underarm down to the top of the pocket and from the hem up to the bottom of the pocket. Before we go to the sewing machine, it's often a good idea to double check that your front and your back pockets are positioned in the right place. To do this, I will align the side seams. If there's any discrepancy at all, you will want to move your pockets. They need to be the same for when we sew the side seams together. Once you're happy, we can head to the sewing machine and we're going to sew the pockets in place onto the garment along the straight edge. Now, rather than sewing our finished seam allowance here, we're going to be sewing a seam allowance that's 1/8 of an inch, 2 to 3 millimeters smaller. So my finished seam allowance is 3/8 of an inch, 1 centimeter. I will be attaching my pocket at a distance of 1/4 of an inch, 6 millimeters from the edge of my material. This is so that the pocket will actually sit back a little bit more hidden on the finished garment. Start with a back stitch and sew along the pocket, attaching it to the garment. End with the back stitch. Complete this for all 4 pockets, your 2 fronts and your 2 backs. Once you've sewn your pocket pieces to your garment pieces, we can work to finish the side seams of the garment using the overlocker or serger. Simply overlock along the side seam of all 4 pieces, the 2 fronts and the 2 backs. You want to be finishing the raw edge of the material and not cutting anything away. Make sure that the pocket stays out of the way so that you don't accidentally cut this whilst you're overlocking. Now you can see my back pattern where I've finished overlocking the side seam, including the straight edge of the pocket. You can give the overlocked seam a press to make sure that it sits flat and trim any threads. Complete for the front and back garment pieces. Moving on, we're going to apply some edge stitching to the pocket. This is so that the pocket bag stays neatly inside the pocket once it's been sewn. Push the pocket towards the seam allowances, and you're going to be sewing along the long edge of the pocket, a couple of millimeters, 1/8 of an inch away from the seam that joined the pocket onto the side of the garment, sewing through both the pocket and all of the seam allowances underneath. And you're going to want to do this to all 4 pockets. At the sewing machine, I'm using my edge stitching foot, which means that I can align the seam between the pocket and the garment with the front bar of my foot. I'm then going to move my needle 2 points towards the pocket, which means that I'm sewing a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch away from the seam that joins the pocket to the garment, 2 to 3 millimeters. Backstitch at the start and at the end and complete this for the length of your pocket. Now that the pockets have been edge stitched, like you see here, we can work to sew the side seams together. Take the front of your garment and the back of your garment and position them with the right sides together along the side seams. You're going to want to be matching the top of the garment, whether that's the underarm of a dress or the waist of a skirt, the pocket notches, as well as the bottom of the garment, so the hem. Remember that the pocket bags will be an extension of the garment going away from the side seam. I have my exterior and my lining pocket bags connected with the right sides together. You're going to want to sew the side seam and the pocket. My preference is usually to sew from the hem of the garment up, but it doesn't really matter and it depends on a variety of things. Sew towards the pocket notch. At the pocket notch, pivot the work and sew around the pocket. When you reach the next pocket notch, once again, pivot the work and sew the rest of the side seam. It's generally a good idea to add some pins across the pocket opening. I usually position my pins in so that the pin is going in on the previous pocket stitching, and I'm checking that the pin is going through to the other side on the same stitching. This just makes sure that the pockets are positioned directly on top of each other. To make it easy to sew around the pocket opening, I will usually draw some marks on. I'm going to draw a chalk mark on in line with my pocket notch at both the top of the pocket and the bottom of the pocket. This is my seam allowance, 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch, in from my pocket. You may find it easier to draw on the stitching line for these corners of your pocket, and you can do that with chalk or a removable pen. Once the first side has been prepared, you can do exactly the same thing to prepare the second side. I would recommend that you sew the garments on both sides in the same direction. This helps to reduce any risk of discrepancy. I usually turn my work around to the right side to double check everything prior to heading to the sewing machine. At the sewing machine, we can begin with a backstitch. Sew along the material following your seam allowance. Mine is 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch. When you get to the pockets, you're going to position your needle in on your marked point or at the pocket notch. Turn your work. You can sew the corner area about 2 centimetres, 3/4 of an inch either side of the corner at a reduced stitch length of 1.5 millimetres to reinforce the opening. Alternatively, you can add some other reinforcement steps once the pocket is sewn. I will discuss these shortly. Sew around the pocket, keeping the same seam allowance. When you get back to the other side of the pocket and the pocket notch, you will once again position your needle into the material and turn your work. You can then proceed to finish sewing the side seam of the garment, backstitching when you get to the end. Complete this for both sides. On completion, check that you're happy with your sewing and that you've stopped and started at the exact same point for your pocket on both sides of your garment. Turn your work around to the right side and double check everything. Using a seam roll, work to press the seam allowances of the exterior material towards the front. You're welcome to press them open first if you need to. Finish by pressing the pocket flat, going towards the front of the garment. Check your pocket from the right side of the garment. Look at the front pocket, where you have a difference between the lining pocket bag and the exterior material. You want to have the same distance between the lining pocket bag and the folded edge of the pocket all the way along the pocket opening. If this isn't even, you may not have pressed your pocket completely flat in the seam, and you may want to tweak it from the right side of the garment or the inside of the pocket. If you sewed your pocket at a standard stitch length of 2.5 millimeters, it can be a good idea to add some reinforcement to the pocket opening. You can do this in the form of a bar tack on the right side of the garment. You would do this at the top and bottom opening of the pocket. I decided that I didn't want the look of a bar tack on this particular garment, so I'm going to go to the inside of the pocket to add my reinforcement instead. I'm going to sew over the corner stitching of the pocket, 2 centimetres, 3/4 of an inch, either side of the corner. I'm going to do this at my sewing machine with my standard 2.5 millimeter stitch length. This is only required if you sew your initial pocket at 2.5mm. As suggested in the pocket sewing, if you reduced your stitch length to 1.5mm around the corners, you would not need to sew over yourself. I will start with the back stitch, sew up to the corner, position my needle in the material, turn the work, and sew away from the corner, aiming for about 2 centimeters, 3/4 of an inch distance either side of the corner. And I will complete this for both corners on both pockets. And there we have it. That is the construction for method 1. Let's move on to covering the sewing for method 2. Method 2 is going to create you a pocket that from the right side looks very similar to method 1. However, the pocket is not set back from the seam. The benefit of method 2 is on the inside, where the pocket is forced towards the front of the garment, which holds it nicely in position. Take your front garment with the right side facing up. Take your front pocket bags, mine are cut in lining, and position the right side of the pocket bags against the right side of your exterior material, aligning the side seams and the notches for the pockets. It's really important that the notches for the opening of the pocket are marked correctly. We will be sewing to attach the pocket onto the front of the garment between the notches. It's a good idea to fold your garment in half to double check that the notches and the pockets are in a symmetrical position. At the sewing machine, you will start sewing at the notch on the pocket, and you will sew the pocket onto the garment following your seam allowance. Mine is 1 centimeter, 3/8 of an inch. Just to note, I am not sewing this at a smaller distance, like I've done with the other pocket method. I'm sewing this at my seam allowance. It's really important that you start and stop sewing at the notches. Backstitch to secure. Once the pockets are sewn in position, we're going to take our scissors and we're going to cut at an angle from the side seam to the end of the pocket stitching, which would be the notch. You will cut on opposite angles for both ends of the pocket, cutting close to but not through the stitching, approximately 1/8 of an inch, 3mm away. Press the pocket towards the seam allowances, away from the front of the garment. Because of how you've clipped into the pocket seam allowances, you should be able to release the seam allowances either side of the pocket notches. This allows us to focus the next couple of steps solely on the pocket and those seam allowances sitting directly behind the pocket. If you want to, you are welcome to finish these seam allowances using the overlocker or serger. Alternatively, you can leave them, as they will be hidden by how the pocket is sewn towards the front of the garment. If you're planning to finish the seam allowances at the overlocker or serger, you want to start with a nice thread chain, about 5 centimeters, 2 inches long. Make sure that you are only finishing the area of the pocket that you've cut into. The rest of the seam allowances should be out of the way, as they will be finished later on. Finish the raw edge without cutting any of the material away. I'm aligning the raw edge to the edge of my blade. When you get to the end of the seam, keep the rest of the seam allowances out of the way as you sew off the material. Create a thread chain of about 5 centimeters, 2 inches long. Tidy the overlocking or serging thread chain by firstly giving it a trim, then using a large-eyed needle or a darning needle to thread the thread chain into the needle. This will allow you to position the needle back up through the overlocking or serging, underneath the stitching, for about 1 inch, 2.5 centimeters. You can then cut the overlocking or serging thread and you have neatened the end of this seam, complete for both sides of the seam. Once again, send the pocket away from the front of the garment towards the seam allowances. Move the seam allowances either side of the notches out of the way and give the pocket a press. We're now going to edge stitch onto the pocket, attaching it to the seam allowances below. At the sewing machine, I'm using my edge stitching foot and I will move my needle towards the pocket bag by 1 or 2 places. The aim is to sew a 1/16 to 1/8 of an inch, 2 to 3 millimeters away from the seam joining the pocket onto the exterior material. You must start and stop sewing at the pocket notches. We are solely attaching the pocket onto those clipped seam allowances underneath. Backstitch at the start and at the end. Now that the understitching has been completed, we're going to attach the back pocket onto the front pocket. Take your back pocket and position the right side of the back pocket against the right side of the front pocket, aligning the side seam edges of the pockets above and below the notches, as well as the outside area of the pockets together. At the corners where the notches are, just make sure that the front garment is completely out of the way. We are solely placing the front and the back pocket together. Make sure the pockets are laying completely flat. Then you can go to the sewing machine and sew the pockets together, starting at the notch and sewing all the way around the pockets to the opposite notch using your seam allowance. At the sewing machine, you're going to want to start sewing the front and the back pockets together, starting at the side seam edge at the notch. This is that seam allowance that you clipped free from the rest of the pocket. Start with the back stitch and sew all the way around the curves of the pocket, sewing your seam allowance. Mine is 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch. When you get to the other notch, you will once again be sewing all the way to the edge of the pocket and that clipped seam allowance. Now that you've sewn around the outside of the pocket, you want to make sure that everything is sitting flat. Press it if you need to. Then we're going to head to the front seam of the pocket to press this in place. With the inside of the front pocket and your understitching facing up, you should be able to see a small amount of your exterior material along the edge. Press this in position along the front pocket opening. Before we move on to attach the back of the garment and sew the side seam, you can finish the seam allowances around the pocket using your desired method. I'm going to use the overlocker or serger. Start at the edge of the material at that clipped free seam allowance for your pocket, the same area that you sewed on the sewing machine. I like to overlock a little bit closer to my stitching line. So rather than align the edge of the material with the inside of the blade, I'm going to align my sewing machine stitching line with the position of the left needle on my overlocker or serger. I'm using the right needle on my overlocker, which means that I will be stitching about 1/8 of an inch, 3 millimeters away from the sewing machine stitching line. Complete this around the entire length of the pocket, overlocking and finishing both the front pocket and the back pocket at the same time. Trim away the overlocking threads. The side seam alongside the straight edge of the back pocket will be finished once the back has been attached to the garment. Position the front of the garment with the right side facing up. Make sure the seam allowances above and below the pocket notch where you clipped are sitting out in line with the rest of the side seam and the straight edge of the back pocket. The front pocket should be nicely finished and pressed in position. The rest of the seam allowances will be finished when the back pattern is attached. Take the back of the garment and place this onto the front, with the right sides facing one another. Align the side seams from the underarm and hem towards the pocket. Align the notches at the pocket. Let me show you what we'll be sewing before we cover it up with the back of the garment. The seam will sew down to the pocket notch, catching the free seam allowances in the seam allowance. The finished edge of the pocket should be out of the way, as you'll be sewing the back of the pocket onto the back of the garments. At the bottom edge of the pocket, the same rules apply. You want to be catching the pocket seam allowances only, not the finished edge of the pocket. Work to pin over the length of the pocket. You'll be sewing the back of the pocket to the back of the garment only at this point. Position pins along the length of the side seam. Check the work from the front. The seam allowances outside of the pocket opening should be hidden from view. Once happy, you can take the work to the sewing machine. At the sewing machine, you're going to be sewing your side seam using your seam allowance. My seam allowance is 1 centimetre, 3/8 of an inch. Generally speaking, when sewing a garment, I will usually sew from the hem of the garment up. You're welcome to follow that same technique with your pocket, but as long as everything is aligned correctly and you sew both sides in the same direction, you can work to sew the garment in the direction that works best for you and your project. Backstitch to begin and sew along the side seam until you reach the first pocket notch. At the pocket notch, it's really important that you sew an accurate seam allowance. You should be able to feel the finished front edge of the pocket between the layers of fabric. When you sew over the pocket notch, you should be sewing really close to this, but not on this. Once you've passed the pocket notch, you must not catch that front finished edge of the pocket, but you should be sewing your seam allowance. You can push or pull the front edge of the pocket out of the way if you need to. When you get to the second notch of the pocket, you complete the same technique that you did for the first notch. It can be a good idea to reinforce the stitching over both of the pocket notches. You can do this by reducing the stitch length to 1.5 millimeters or backstitching. Complete sewing the side seam on both sides so that you're left with something that looks like this from the wrong side. It's always best to double check your work from the right side prior to continuing. We want to make sure that we haven't got any of those seam allowances above and below the notch of the pocket appearing out of the seam. If you didn't reinforce the opening for the pockets on the initial seam, it can be a good idea to put your work back through and sew approximately an inch, 2.5 centimeters, directly over the pocket opening. If you're putting your work back through, I would recommend that you either sew this in the same stitch length, my standard 2.5 millimeters, and sew directly on top of the previous stitching, or do a small back stitch over the notch. You can also do a bar tack on the right side of the garment if you prefer. Finish the side seam by running it through the overlocker or serger, or completing your finishing method. As I run this through the overlocker, I'm going to overlock a little bit closer to my stitching line like I did around the outside edge of the pocket. I will align the sewing machine stitching with the placement of the left needle. I'm only using the right needle on my overlocker, so I will be overlocking about 2 to 3 millimeters, a 1/16 to an 1/8 of an inch away from the original stitching line. Make sure that the pocket is nicely out of the way. As you do this, you don't want to catch the pocket underneath. Now that the side seam has been neatly finished, you can push the pocket towards the front of the garment. You will see that it wants to fix in this position. Use a seam roll to press the seam allowances of the side seam towards the back of the garment. They will be forced in this position. And here you have it, your finished pocket for method 2.
Thanks for watching. I really hope you enjoyed this tutorial and you learned a new technique. I hope to see you in the next one.